was a pretty good touch, actually. I used myself. Normally, I would have a slide that has 7 bullet points, and it tells you I'm going to talk about 7 things. There actually are 7 bullet points there, and I'm going to talk about those 7 things. But I want to present them to you first in this way so you don't get the wrong idea. This is not a set of bullet points that are sequential in any necessary way. They're not hierarchical. One doesn't need to be in place for the other to be understood, but they are very strongly interrelated. Each one affects the other, and I think one way of saying it is each one makes the other worse. You know, the discourse of climate change is a pretty discouraging thing. I will have some moments of hope along the way at the end, but these are mutually exacerbating factors, and I want to go through each one and try to do it in the amount of time allotted. I don't promise to be exactly on time, but I will try. Okay, the first thing is misjudgments about audience. And I think this is an example of how most of us think about the climate change argument. On one side is science, the other side is denial. I have as a representative of the denial side someone who is a famous Twitterer who twittered the concept that global warming was created by and for the Chinese. And on the other side, there's a headline from Mother Jones that says, "Every insane thing Donald Trump has said about global warming." And we think of argument in this way. We think of the climate change argument in this way. On one side is science, and the other side is anti-science. And this is a very easy way to think of argument because it is a typical way to think of all argument. There's a metaphor, figurative language and thought is one of my areas. There's a metaphor that we use to think about argument. It's called argument is war. So whenever we talk about argument, we're tempted to think, in fact, we routinely think of, you have one side arguing this point, the other side arguing the opposite point, and the whole aim is to defeat the other side. And it's not the only metaphor we have for argument, but it's a dominant metaphor that we have for argument. And in this case, maybe in a lot of cases, maybe all cases, I don't know. But at least in this case, it's very destructive. There's a lot of criticism of this way of thinking of argument. You may know the name Deborah Tannen, who wrote a book about argumentation being so dominant and two-sided argumentation being so dominant in our public discourse, and very critical of it because everything has two sides and they're always contentious and it's always hostile. And even when things are better off not understood in that way, we might be better off thinking of arguments something like this. Not two-sided, but at least 3 parties. And this is much oversimplified even at this, but it helps to at least get to 3. Because you have on one side people in the public arguing about science, in favor of science. Other people arguing that the science is wrong or that it's a hoax or something like that. But that's not the end of it, because most arguments, especially in writing and especially on television and public broadcast, have 3 parts. You have the 2 sides. They make sure that we have 2 sides. It's not by accident that we're presented with 2 sides very often. And then we have an audience that is an audience of deciders. Now I've used just one guy looking up quizzically at these 2 sides, but it really is not helpful to think of it as one person. You're one person, but you're part of a collective, and you talk to each other. And when you think of more sides, you have a lot more options. So let's think about what that third component might be. What would we expect of that component? We would expect a lot of things, especially for an argument about fact. Climate science, one of the reasons that one of the reasons, the main reason that I did a study of this is because I wanted a hard example. I don't come to this because of interest in the science. It has turned out to be interesting, but it's not what brought me to it. What brought me to it was an interest in argumentation and how it works. So I wanted a hard example. Something that is polarized like abortion can be a hard example, but the problem with it is I think I understand it very well. Climate change I don't understand very well. Why is it an argument at all? It's about facts. We can either decide or we can't. Well, even in an argument about facts, we have certain conditions to make the argument go well. We expect certain things from the audience. And this is from us. We're the audience. We expect the audience to agree on the terms of the debate, or the listener to agree on or the reader to agree on the terms of the debate, that facts count. We expect a certain kind of open-mindedness, that if the facts are persuasive, the audience will be persuaded. But in addition to that, we expect a certain kind of skepticism, a healthy skepticism. If your audience is not skeptical, they're not participating. It's part of what is needed in a healthy, argumentative situation. So if we imagine not the two sides yelling at each other, they're not really each other's audience. There's no persuasion that's going to go on. If we think about the third component, then we have something that might happen if those conditions are met. I think that those conditions are usually met. There are people who are very firm in their convictions, maybe firm in their misunderstandings or their understandings, and they're not going to change their minds. However, I think there is something that is called, what I would call a fair-minded skeptic. And they're out there, and I think one way we know that they're out there is because when we look at the public opinion polls, the research is done by groups like Pew. Acceptance of climate science waxes and wanes. Usually in response to weather events. You know, bad weather makes people believe there's a problem. But you wouldn't have that waxing and waning if people weren't willing to change their minds. So we do have something out there that is fair-minded skepticism, and that skepticism can take a lot of forms. It's not all, I think it's a hoax. I think more commonly, and I talk to a lot of people about this, it's not systematic always, but when I talk to people about climate change, the people who don't believe it will say, I don't know if there's enough proof. If they say there's enough proof that the Earth is warming, they will say, yes, but I don't know how much of that is natural variation or how much of it is human caused. If they accept that, they may say, well, yeah, it's warming and people are causing it, at least in part, but maybe they're exaggerating the dangers. So there's a lot of variation in this third component. And I've framed this as a problem that we misunderstand what audiences are, and that is a problem. But there's a hopeful side to that, that if we understand better, maybe there's something that we can do. So, that's a blank slide. I'm going to fill it up in just a minute. But I will say that we have this audience and we're operating in this area of contention. And it's very difficult to make decisions. Because one thing that is wrong, and this is part of quite a number of things that militate against being able to make a good decision. One is that we live in a time of radical skepticism. We have a lot of reasons to be skeptical, but we don't believe much of anything. And I'll give you an example. I showed my students in a graduate class this week a marketing flyer. And it was for a town much like DeKalb, though it wasn't DeKalb. And it painted this as a wonderful vacation spot. What great places to go. Why, I should take a vacation in a town a lot like DeKalb. DeKalb's a great town, but I don't come to DeKalb for a vacation usually. It's usually somewhere else. And I said, do you see any ethical problems here? And they said no. Why, I said? They're not telling the truth. They're shading the truth. Isn't that a problem? It's not a problem because they don't expect me to believe it. Everybody knows this is marketing. I don't have to believe it. They give what I'm calling a truth discount. We are surrounded with this. Truth discounts for everything. Also, there's out expectation of fraud. Think of the numbers of memoirs that have been faked, a million little pieces, 3 cups of tea, or something like that. Part of this disbelief is encouraged by media reports, particularly in relation to science. The grand narrative of science that gets talked about is usually always progress, always discovery, the scientist as hero. But if you read the paper, if you listen to the radio, if you watch television, it's probably my phone, I don't know. I like that song. Part of the discovery story is everybody was always wrong. So even when it's good news about a scientific story, it's also bad news. I read something a couple of years ago when I was researching this book about mouse studies, and it said in the New York Times, mouse studies don't work. This was having to do with sepsis. And it said that we should have known it all along, because it takes many, many times as much bacteria to kill a mouse as it takes to kill a human being. We should have known it wouldn't work for these studies. Well, these scientists, they're not very smart. And on top of that, they said, even after this study was done, it was proven very strong, it was a very strong study. They had a very hard time getting it published because the referee said it can't be true. So we have part of the study, part of the situation is the scientists didn't see something that was obvious. The scientists couldn't get it published when they found the truth. This is a very persistent story in the press. There was another one in the New York Times, not the New York Times, in the New Yorker a couple of years ago, about the decline effect. This is the problem of replicating experimental studies. You know, you should be able to replicate an experiment. But they were finding that even things you think would be very easily replicable, things like the symmetry of the tail feathers of birds, how could you get more objective than that? You just measure it. They're having trouble replicating it. Of course, we wouldn't know about this if the scientists weren't telling us. Remember that. But here's a big story in the New Yorker, and it has the titillating effect of telling us everything we think is true isn't true. We think science is reliable and objective, but it's not, and that's rhetorically very powerful. This is just a I have the wrong slide. I'll go back and forth. This is the quotation from the New Yorker, and I don't ask you to read it. I just ask you to notice the name. The reporter who wrote it was Jonah Lehrer. Jonah Lehrer got really famous because his book had to be retracted by the publisher because he had fake quotes about Bob Dylan. It's all around us, this skepticism about what would be true and what might not be true. Perceptions of scientists, this is not readable, I know. I just couldn't reformat it from the form I took it from on the web. But this is a Pew study of how people feel about climate scientists, a poll. And I'll just read a couple of things. This is responsive. Climate scientists understand very well whether climate change is occurring. That's 33% of people. That they understand very well. climate change has occurred. 33% of people think that.